Okay, class, I'm on page 137. So I'll write that up there to start us off. And this lesson is 4.3, which is estimating. So use rounding or compatible numbers. So we're back to estimating. Before we get started, I'm going to put the rule up. So if we remember, if a number, the bossy neighbor is 5 or more, then the bossy neighbor says the number needs to go up. If the number is 4 or less, the bossy neighbor is telling the number it needs to stay. Okay, with that in mind, let's look at our question we have here. So it says, choose two factors from the numbers below to find a product that is as close to 1,600 or 1,600 as possible. So the first thing I'm going to start with is I'm going to round each one of these numbers. So I'm going to round it to the tens place. So if I look at 24, okay, and I'm rounding to the tens place, I look at the bossy neighbor. This 4 is 4 or less, so that means it is going to tell my number to stay. So it's going to be a 2, and then the 4 becomes a 0. So that 24 is going to round to 20. If I look at 32, I'm looking at the tens place. The 2 is my bossy neighbor. That 2 is telling my 3 to stay, so it's going to be a 3, and the 2 becomes a 0. And then if I look at 61, again, rounding to the tens place, the 1 is the bossy neighbor. The 1 is telling my 6 to stay. So 6, and then the 1 becomes a 0. And then the last number is 78. Looking at the tens place, 8 is the bossy neighbor. 8 is 5 or more, so that's going to tell my 7, hey, you need to go up. So the 7 is going to become an 8, and then we put a 0 on the end. So now that I've rounded my numbers, I'm going to look at these numbers and think, would any of these numbers, if I multiplied them together, would it create 1,600? So like we've been working on, I'm going to kind of ignore all of these zeros, and I'm just going to focus on the number in the tens place. And I'm going to see, okay, do any of these numbers, when I multiply them together, make 16? So if I do 2 times 3, that would be 6. So that's not going to work. If I do 2 times 6, that would be 12. So that wouldn't work. If I do 2 times 8, that equals 16. So if I look at 20 times 80, like I just said, we're going to save our zeros. 2 times 8, we're going to focus on that. That's 16. And then these zeros, I just need to bring them over. That would give me an answer that's 1,600. I can look and see if I can make any other combinations. We know that 2 times 3 doesn't work, but I could look at 3 times 6, which 3 times 6 is 18. That's too big. That won't work. 3 times 8 is 24. That's too big. That won't work. So really, the only combination I could make that would get me close to 1,600 would be 20 times 80. Let's go on to the next page. All right, here we are with the next page. So this is actually page 138. And before I start, since I know that this whole lesson is going to be about estimating, I'm going to rewrite my rule. So 5 or more, the number is going to go up. 4 or less, stay. Okay, so let's look at these problems we have here. So it says the workers picked 14 dozen apples at Miss Piper's apple grove and 12 dozen apples at Mr. Stewart's apple grove. There are 12 apples in 1 dozen. About how many apples did the workers pick? Okay, so it's showing us right here that first I'm looking at this part right here. We're going to take 14 plus 12. And the reason for that is because the workers picked 14 dozen at Mrs. Piper's, and then another 12 dozen, whoops, didn't mean to cross it out, at Mr. Stewart's. So we want to know altogether how many dozens of apples did they pick. So 14 plus 12 would be 26. Now, they have 26 dozen, but that's not telling us how many apples, because there's 12 apples right here. Oh, it doesn't want to write. 12 apples in 1 dozen. So that's why, if we're looking down here, we're doing 26 times 12. So if we pay attention to what the book's doing, first, we're going to round. So 26, 6 is the bossy neighbor. It's 5 or more, so it tells the 2 to go up to a 3, so now we have 30. And then for 12, the 2 is the bossy neighbor, and that's 4 or less, so it tells the 1 to stay, and it becomes 10. So now our problem is 30 times 10, which I could ignore my zeros. 3 times 1 is 3, and then put my zeros back on. So the workers ended up picking about 300 apples. And we say about because it's not an exact number since we're rounding. It's showing that another way we could do it right here is that they're saying 26 is close to 25, and then 12 is close to 10. So instead of rounding it to the tens place, we're just kind of going, where is it closer to? Is it closer to 20? Is it closer to 25? Or is it closer to 30? Kind of thing. And for 12, it would be, is it closer to 10? Is it closer to 15? Is it closer to 20? So they're picking 25 times 10. Same idea. 25 times 1 would be 25, and then put a 0 on it. To be honest, I'm not a fan of using compatible numbers because it can just get confusing to where we want to round to. I'm going to say that we just focus on rounding this way for right now. All right, so let's move on to the next page. Here we are on page 139. Again, writing my rule. You don't have to write this every time. I'm just putting it there so you guys can see it. So 5 or more, it's going to go up. 4 or less, we're going to stay. So normally when we look at guided practice, I don't really do the do you understand, but I think that this one, for number 1, it is important. So number 1 says, in the example on the previous page, how do you know you only need an estimate and not an exact answer? So if you go back and look at the question on the previous page, it ends with about how many apples did the workers pick. So anytime you see about in a word problem, it usually means you need to estimate. I'm not going to have enough room. Ooh, maybe I will. Okay, so again, if it ever says about, then you're going to want to estimate. Okay, now let's look at the do you know how. I'm going to ask that you do all 4 of these problems today. So I'm here. And the do you know how? So I'm asking that you do numbers 3, 4, 5, and 6. I would round these to the tens place, so the greatest place value. And I'm going to ask you to pause the video, do these on your own, and then put the video back on to see how you did. All right, so go ahead and pause the video, and I'll see you in a little bit. All right, so let's look at number 3. We have 24 times 18. We're rounding to the tens place. So the 4 is my bossy neighbor and this 8 is my bossy neighbor. The 4 is going to tell the 2 to stay. The 8 is going to tell the 1 to go up because it's 5 or more. So the 1 becomes a 2. 8 becomes a 0. So now I just ignore my zeros. I do 2 times 2, which is 4. And then I have to bring these zeros back over. So my answer would be 400. For number 4, we have 33 times 31. I'm rounding to the tens place. Ignore, or not ignore. Here's our bossy neighbors. So this 3 is 4 or less. So it's going to tell that 3, hey, you need to stay. So it's a 3. And I put a 0 on the end. Here, the bossy neighbor is a 1. So it's 4 or less. So it tells that 3, hey, you need to stay. So it's a 3. Put the 0 on. Now, ignore my zeros for right now. 3 times 3 is 9. And then I bring my 2 zeros over. For number 5, we have 38 times 22, rounding to the tens place. Got an 8 as a bossy neighbor and a 2 as a bossy neighbor. So here, the 8 is 5 or more. So that tells the 3, you need to go up. Then I put a 0 on the end. Here, 2 is 4 or less. So it tells the 2, you need to stay. Put the 0 on. So now, again, ignore my zeros for now. 4 times 2 is 8. And then put my 2 zeros on. All right, last one. Number 6, we have 45 times 48. 5 is our bossy neighbor. 8 is our bossy neighbor. Over here, this 5 is going to tell the 4 to go up. So it becomes a 5 with a 0. Here, this 8 tells the 4 to go up. So it's going to become a 5. Put my 0. Ignore my zeros for a minute. 5 times 5 is 25. And then put my zeros back on. So my answer would be 2,500. All right, you can go ahead and go on to independent practice now. So hopefully you understood how to do those problems. If not, don't forget that's why I'm here. So now you can go ahead and get started on independent practice.